I'm forever confused going into the rest of the week, what day it actually was today. So today we are going to study the very short Shir Shel Yom for Friday. Maybe we'll wrap up early. We'll see how long it takes us. It is only 5 psukim, which is really relatively short. You'll remember we've spoken about some very long ones, like the one for Wednesday, which has a lot of jokes attached to it, and Tuesday is very short. One of the reasons why we always say Tuesday is a day of good mazel. You have a short Shir Shel Yom, and Friday is even shorter. But the other thing you'll notice is that on the Tehillim Perek Tzadi Gimel is not just familiar because it is the song of the day for Friday, but it is also repeated again. It was added into the davening Friday night. It was added to Kabbalah Shabbos. And so we really end up saying it 2 times. So I guess it works out well that it's a short one because we end up saying it 2 times on Friday. So what I'd like us to keep in mind as we go through the Perek, and again, it's just 5 short psukim, as we go through is to think about why it is connected to Friday, and of course, why it's really also a parak that takes us into Shabbos. So it's not just Friday during the day, but Friday in the evening as well. Let's actually just start with a couple of those ideas, and then we'll go through the psukim one by one. So one possibility is that as we're going to see, and I'll share my screen with you, as we're going to see, here we go. Just bring it up so you can see. Here we go. Move it over a little bit. Sorry. There we go. Okay. So as you're going to see, there are going to be a lot of references to Hashem being the king, Hashem being in charge, Hashem ruling over nature. And the first time that this really becomes possible is on day 6 of creation. So that even though we're going to refer to the fact, just like we say in Adon Olam and many other places, that Hashem was always here, Hashem will always be here. He's the Kadmon and he's the Acharon, right? He preceded all of us, not just us, but everyone who came before us. And he will be here after things don't even look the same way that they are now. At the end of days, God will always be here. He was and he always will be. And that is always true. But there was nobody here to acknowledge that fact until day 6 of creation. And so what makes Friday such a unique day, as we've tried to sort of connect not just the Shir Shel Yom to the day, but what can we then learn from this idea? What can I take into the day with me as I, finish my davening, as I say the Shir Shel Yom? What kind of direction am I supposed to have for this day? So Friday is a unique day, as we know, not just because we are rushing around getting ready for Shabbos, but because it was a day when human beings were created. And I think this is something we don't really focus on, except for maybe around Rosh Hashanah time, but we focus on the creation of all of humankind and the creation of the animal kingdom as well. All of this took place on Friday, the last active day of creation. And this is something that is worth focusing on, right? This is the birthday of all mankind. Every Friday is, harkens back to that original day 6, that original Friday. And what's so, I think, powerful about this idea is that this marks the day upon which Hashem became the king of the world. Because even though he was always here, and even though he always will be there, with a king is not a king unless he has subjects. And as we look in this first pasuk, the first thing we notice is Hashem Malach, right? Hashem is king. Hashem was king. And what's important to note is the concept of being a melech, of being a king, is not just being a ruler. A moshel is the word in Hebrew that we would use as a ruler, like the root of memshala, right? The government. Moshel is a ruler. A ruler doesn't necessarily imply that he has been accepted by his people. We know in Israel, right, the people almost never accept who's the Rosh Memshala. Some yes, some no. Today yes, tomorrow no. It just depends when you ask. But that's part of the joy of being in Israeli politics, I'm sure. But a melech is totally different. And this is really why we don't have such a thing over the Jewish people right now, right? We might describe somebody casually as a melech. Wow, that person's such a king. But in general, that's not something we can relate to. There are very few, countries in the world now who still have a king. Melech implies that there are subjects. And when there are subjects, that implies that they've accepted the king upon themselves. There's a relationship where he's accepted them as subjects and they've made him king. And they kind of can't exist one without the other, right? They're not a people without their king, and a king's not a king without his people. And therefore, there is something very powerful about Friday being that day when that first became possible. So Hashem malach geut lavesh. He adorned, he dressed himself in geut. Now, word is going to take us a little bit of time to work through. The concept of geut. What does it mean to be ge'ah or ge'eh? Comes very much related to the concept of ga'ava, of pride. And normally, the idea that a human being would have ga'ava, would be proud, would be overly haughty. I think is sometimes haughty is the word that's often used to translate the word gava, the midah, the character trait of gava. It's viewed horribly negatively. I mean, if ever there was a midah, a character trait that is raked over the coals in all of the Musar books, it would be gava. It is viewed as, it's not as bad as anger, but it is up there, maybe just like one below anger. The reason for that being is that anger, there's never an appropriate time for it. Even when we are supposed to display anger, a person's never allowed to feel anger. And that is not actually true about gaiva. So I guess I should be, full disclosure, the concept of a person having gava, of being haughty, while viewed very, very negatively, it does have its appropriate times. And as we'll go over in a second, there are times and spaces and people at specific times who should experience a little bit of gaiva, but in general, we view it as something really to stay away from. A person feeling as though they are more than is generally viewed as a very negative thing. So it's fascinating that here Hashem is talked about as being somebody who adorns himself in gaiva. So I was listening to a shir from Rabbi Breitowitz, Yitzchak Breitowitz, who lives in Israel now, but was a Rav for many, many years in like the Washington, D.C., Silver Spring area. Brilliant, brilliant man. You can listen to him give a shir on literally any topic, from like the most detailed medical ethics, because he gets the medicine and the halacha, to shirim on Tanakh and Jewish philosophy and everything in between. He's quite brilliant. I found the shir on Torah Anytime, which I'd never been on that website before. So there's a lot of good stuff there. So Rabbi Breitowitz talks about the fact that Hashem, he adorns himself in ga'ava, in pride, means that it's not actually part of who Hashem is. It's something he puts on, in the same way that we all have specific character traits that are okay when we put them on at certain times, but it's something that you can put on and something you can take off. It's never meant to be an intrinsic part of oneself. So he points that out, that it's geut lavesh. It's not that we say Hashem himself is gaiva. We've called Hashem a bunch of things, and he's described by David HaMelech so often in different terms. But here, when it comes to being proud or being haughty, that's something that is viewed that Hashem clothes himself, because, if it's clothing, you can put it on and you can take it off. I thought that was an interesting point. As well, it's interesting to note that the concept of Hashem being proud, right? What is Hashem proud of? What is he haughty over? So a couple of ways of understanding this, and this is really going to take us through one of the main themes of this very short parak, but very powerful. It like packs a punch. It's pocket size, but it packs a punch. That Hashem in his experiencing pride. So one way of explaining that is that he is looking out over, someone's pointing out, that's great to know. He gives a Parsha class, great. Is that Hashem, when he experiences pride, like what does he get nachas from? What is he feeling proud of or haughty about? So, and I don't remember which one of the Mefarshim says this. There's also, I think, from Rabbi Breitowitz, is that on Friday was the day that Hashem could look back at creation and say like, hey, not bad. We know at the end of every day he reflected, right? It says Vayar Hashem, and Hashem looked back at the end of the day after the creation, Vayar ki tov, and it was good. Every day, some days twice, some days none, but overall, that was the experience that he created. And then he looked back and thought, yeah, not bad. But there's something so much more satisfying when a person can look back at the end of a project and see that it was good. So obviously we're ascribing these personality traits that we generally don't ascribe to Hashem, but in order to be able to relate to him and understand him in terms that work for us, we can relate to this idea of at the end of that 6-day project, Hashem looks back and is like, yeah, I did well. I did a good job. We know later on he might regret some of the things that he does, as the Torah tells us in Parshas Noach. But overall, there is a sense of accomplishment, and Hashem deserves it, so to speak. Like we could say, yeah, he could feel pride about that. However, there is one time where we have said, in general, gaiva is not a good thing for a human being. There's one source in the Gemara that I'm familiar with that says that a Talmid Chacham is supposed to have gaiva, is supposed to be proud, is supposed to be haughty. But by how much? And this is such a great phrase, shmini shebeshminit, right? An eighth of an eighth. I don't know, what does that make, a 64th? I'm not a fractions person. So a Talmid Chacham, a Torah scholar, is someone who can and should actually have a modicum, a small amount of gaiva, because that is what allows the person to recognize that they have what to teach, they have what to contribute. And even though none of us are Talmidei Chachamim, but that concept, that idea, that ideal of recognizing one's value and one's worth, and when we have what to contribute, is very, very significant. So as much as we are saying, yeah, Hashem has what to be proud of course it makes sense that he adorns himself in geut. That's never something we should do. That we're not going to say. We're not going to say never, because it's important, as the famous, I don't know if it's a quote, an image that Rab Bunim Pshischa illustrates, and I'm sure you've all heard this in the name of other different Hasidic greats, the idea that a person should always walk around with two pieces of paper, one in each pocket, right? One that says, Bishvili nivra ha'olam, the world was created just for me. Hashem put me on this earth, and I'm supposed to take advantage of everything and use my strengths and use my talents. I have so much to contribute. I'm a significant person. I'm substantial. I have what to do. And on the other hand, in the other pocket, just when he's about to think that, he's God's gift to all of humanity, he puts his hand in his other pocket, he pulls out the piece of paper, and that one says, Va'anochi afar va'efer, right? I am but dust and ashes. I was created from earth, and I will one day return to the earth. I am ich bin agornished. I'm a nothing. And that a person's job essentially in this world is to try to balance those two things. I have so much to contribute. And yet when I compare myself, certainly to the Ribono Shalom, but when I compare myself to other people, I might find myself wanting or lacking. I have so much work to do. There is so much more here for me to do. And yes, I have all the skills and talents I need to do it, but also I've got such a long way to go. So that kind of combination is very significant. And that's attributed to this idea of the Shmini Shebeshminis. Actually, I think the Rabbi Breidowitz quoted the Vilna Gaon, who says that if you look, what is the Shmini Shebeshminit? He says it's a hint. Chazal are giving you a clue that you should look up the 8th pasuk. I've never heard this before. The 8th pasuk in the 8th parsha. And if you look it up in Sefer Breshit, so what you find is the story of Yaakov preparing himself to meet his brother Esav. And it's happens to be one of my favorite psukim. I think we talked about this in the parsha class when it was that parsha. Katonti mikola chasadim, right? That Yaakov feels he is undeserving. I am too small for all of the wonderful blessings you have bestowed upon me. Katonti, katonti. I feel so small. It's also a beautiful song by Yonatan Razel. If you've never heard it, I encourage you to check it out. Gorgeous, gorgeous song. Katonti. I'm not deserving, and yet you've given me all these blessings, so that pushes me to accomplish. It pushes me to contribute. So kind of that tension, that duality that we mentioned from Rabbonim Pshischa, kind of the same idea that we get from Yaakov Avinu in that pasuk. And the Gra points that out to us about this idea of Shmini Shebeshminis, an eighth of Gava. Okay, one final idea, and this to me is the most significant. This idea is proposed by the Malbim. Now, the Malbim, fascinating personality. I actually realized that I know nothing about him, so I decided to read a little bit. This is what happens when I am preparing, and then I end up, spending too much time doing a little history and biography research. So the Malbim, who was a vast contributor to our study of Torah, certainly to our study of Tanakh, but as well in halacha and in so many other areas. He was a very prominent Rav in his day, experienced a lot of difficulty, as do most people, and as did most of our great leaders. He was really tormented by both sides of, I guess we would say, the aisle. The Malbim was a very progressive thinker, but he was very, very halachic. These are like the things that nobody tells us about our great leaders. He was so passionate about the accuracy of Torah and of literally explaining every single word. He said, there's no such thing as a synonym in the Torah. And that's essentially his commentary to all of Tanakh, is explaining how every single word tells you something different. It's not just what some of the other Mefarshim tell us. Oh, the Torah is just explaining it in a way that you can understand. Or the Torah is just being poetic here. He says, absolutely not. The Torah is not poetry and it's not literature. You're meant to understand the nuance and the difference. Every time a word is used or a phrase seems like it's repeated in different words, no, you have an obligation to understand. And he contributes like in the greatest way to that conversation of understanding the differences and the nuances in the Hebrew language, in Tanakh. So of course, what happens? He's such a strong proponent of halacha, but he's this great big thinker who is studying the Torah in a way that kind of reinvents the Hebrew language. And so the Hasidim in his area of Poland felt like he was a bit too progressive for them. They were Yiddish speakers and they didn't love that he was bringing back Hebrew in this way. And they also didn't love that I think he was so respected by the assimilationists, by the reform movement. Initially, of course, those things don't always last. He was so respected by them. He sort of knew, because he was so erudite and such an intellectual and so articulate, they also respected him. So for a while, I don't think it lasted so long, a number of years, I think less than 10, he was the chief rabbi of this area and everybody ascribed to him. Everybody, he had the approval of all parts of the Jewish community, that from the Maskilim to the Hasidim, which is wild. And so unfortunately, it didn't last. And eventually, both sides turned on him and he was forced to flee. They turned him in, I don't remember which side it was, I don't want to know, turned him into the government, accused him of treason, and he was only saved from death. He was sentenced to death, the Malbim. It's fascinating. He was only saved from this death sentence because I think it was Moses Montefiore, if I'm not mistaken, intervened on his behalf. And the only way he was freed from prison was if he would leave the empire altogether. And he basically spent the rest of his life wandering from position to position, but he never really found his place. Everyone always recognized his genius and his Torah scholarship, but he kind of didn't have a place. And isn't that just a sad story? But the Malbim did leave us this tremendous legacy. And here is one incredible example of this idea. So the Malbim explains, Hashem Malach, right? Hashem is the king. Geus lavesh. He adorned himself. He robed himself in geut. Lavesh Hashem, right? He also dressed himself. Oz hitazar. He girded himself, like he tied around his hips. Oz, this strength. So says the Malbim, do not make the mistake of thinking that geut and oz are just synonyms of the same thing. Now, you and I might have said, sure, we know that. We know that geut comes from ge'ah, it means pride, and we know oz means strength. But the Malbim explains it in a way, it like blows your mind. It's incredible. He explains the following. What is Hashem robing himself in? What does that mean? It means he's expressing himself. Why does a person wear clothing, aside from the obvious of keeping warm or covering up? It's in order to express themselves out there in the world. And so when David HaMelech tells us that Hashem robed himself, what it means is he put on something so that we could recognize him. Okay. And the reason why what does that reflect? That reflects his geut, his pride, his haughtiness. Says the Malbim, geut refers to when Hashem has suspended or upended the laws of nature. Geut refers to a nes, something miraculous, something supernatural. And that it is in those times that Hashem chooses to reveal himself. And that language of wearing clothing of geus is to help us understand this is Hashem revealing himself. He's revealing himself through these unbelievable miracles. And Hashem is also oz hitazar. Hashem also girds himself, right? He strengthens himself with the concept of oz. And the strength, oz, the Malbim explains, refers to the laws of nature. And this is something that I think we've probably learned together before. You're familiar with this idea. It's spoken about often by the Ramban with relationship to the miracles that happened in Mitzrayim and when the Jewish people were in the desert, that Hashem often does big, great miracles. Rav Hirsch talks about this a lot in order to highlight for us that the everyday running of nature is in and of itself a miracle. And so the question is, of course, which one's more significant, right? One could argue that these miracles where the world gets turned upside down, that's far more significant because those moments are inspiring and they get us excited and they renew our faith and our belief in Hashem. We're like, oh, now we know for sure he exists. Whereas this idea that the laws of nature continue and run every single day, sometimes we need to pause and realize that that in and of itself, the everyday miracle, in some ways you could argue, is far more impressive than the once in a lifetime or the once in a generation type of things. I'll give you some of the examples that the Malbim gives. The one example that he gives is a train. He calls it a mechona, machine, but I think that's what he is referring to. So he says, if there's a train with all of its different mechanisms and all of its different, the coal and the steam and the wheels and all the things that have to go on to make a train work, and it's heading down the tracks and it's going super fast. If a person were to say, oh my gosh, I've got to stop that train because it's heading for a cliff and we've got to make sure that it doesn't go over the cliff. If the person would be able to stop the train, we would say, whoa, that's unbelievable. How could a human being stop a train? He must be Superman, right? That must be a godly person. That's a huge, huge miracle. Says the Malbim, yes, but no. What would be an even greater miracle than being able to stop the train in its tracks? Would be stopping the train, but the wheels are still going, the train is still moving, but you prevent the train from going off the track or from going off the cliff. In other words, if you picture this in our familiar miracle terms, yes, Kriyas Yamsuf, the splitting of the sea, was a major miracle. But do you know what made it so miraculous? And this speaks beautifully to the idea that you could explain the splitting of the sea according to the laws of nature, that it is possible that a wind could come and blow the water up onto its sides, that could be explained in scientific terms. What the Malbim is telling us is what made that such a big miracle is that while the Yamsuf did that, all the other laws of nature kept functioning, right? It's not like he suspended the laws of gravity for the whole world at the same time. No, what it pointed out to us was that Hashem did this great miracle in this one area. I know there are midrashim that say all the water in the world split, but we're not talking about that. But the idea that the Yam Suf itself split, the Jewish people happen to get there at that exact moment and walk through on perfectly dry land while this took place on the seabed, right? I mean, it just doesn't make any sense at all. But the fact that that took place, but the rest of the world was olam kiminhago noheg, the world just kept functioning, right? It's not like, the rest of the world stopped breathing or that gravity stopped being in place or that water just started doing crazy things everywhere. No, the magic, so to speak, the miracle, the geut was that while one thing was happening that was so miraculous, the rest of the world continued functioning according to the laws of nature. I was listening to also a Rabbi Fried, I don't know him, Rabbi Gavriel Fried, I think was his name. And he tells a story that I've heard a million times, but I never can remember the name. So I wrote one of the names down. And it's a story that you've probably heard because it's well known. The story of two families who were making Brit Milah for their babies. I think this just took place in Staten Island near the yeshiva of Reuven Feinstein Zatzal. And the story is as follows, that one of the babies was having his bris on his 8th day. And it was like a very regular experience. You get up, you go to the bris, there's bagels, you wash, you rush off to work. Very nice. This was already not so typical because all the Roshei Yeshiva were at this bris. Why were all the Roshei Yeshiva from the yeshiva in Staten Island at this bris? Because there was a second bris taking place, and that was the bris of the son that was born to the Navarro family, a Rav Navarro. And Rav Navarro and his wife had a baby 3 months prior to this particular day. And that baby was given essentially almost 0% chance of survival. There was a conversation that took place between Rav Navarro and the doctor, who basically said, there's no way this child survives. And Rav Navarro said, you don't get to make that decision. You're the doctor, right? You're the agent. You just get to tell me exactly every single step that we need to take to prove that what you're saying is not true, right? Your job is not to decree life or death. That's out of your hands. Your job is to tell me what we can do to keep this baby alive. And it's an incredible, miraculous story, because this baby, who was born at like 1 pound, 3 months early, at the time that I heard the story, was now 25 years old, and was having a family of his own, and is just a complete and total miracle. So all the attendees at this double bris, they decided to do it together. At this double bris, get this special treat that they get to hear from both the fathers as well as the Rashi Yeshiva. And in the course of all of the speaking, a lot of cute things happened. But in the course of everyone speaking, one of the people who's speaking, and I think it was one of the fathers, gets up at the bris and says, "You all think you're here and you're celebrating a regular bris and a miraculous bris. Right? You're celebrating regular, nature, and supernatural, right? Oz and Geut. That's what you think you're here for." He didn't use those terms. That was my editor's note. But you're wrong. You're wrong. They're both miracles, right? The miracle of the baby that had his bris at 3 months is only there to highlight for you, to remind you that the bris of the baby on the 8th day is also a miracle. There's nothing normal or regular about a woman conceiving and carrying a child for 9 months and delivering a healthy child. Like, that's not something that we should take for granted. Nature in and of itself is a miracle. And we very often are treated to a reminder that that's the case, right? When nature doesn't function the way that it's supposed to. And that is unfortunately true on the miraculous side and also on the natural disaster side. And that is something that we are going to talk about for the rest of the parak. So I know we spent a lot of time on that first pasuk, but like I said, there's only 5 pasukim, so it's okay. And then all this is the case, af tikon tevel bal timot, that even though Hashem is creating these massive miracles, and these miracles could be, according to the commentaries, could be referring to nature itself, the creation and nature itself, could be referring to the time of Yetziat Mitzrayim, all of the different miracles that took place when the Jewish people were leaving Egypt. It could be referring to Matan Torah, to the giving of the Torah. And it could be referring la'atid lavo, right, for what is to come. That is the opinion of the Radak and a bunch of other commentaries. The opinion that one day all of these things will be true. They haven't happened yet, but one day they will be true in the times of Mashiach. And this phrase really proves the point of the Malbim. Af tikon tevel bal timot. First of all, the word tevel always refers to the world and everything in it. We don't really have a word like that in English. It means not just the planet Earth, but every single thing that's included in the planet. Like, I don't know that we necessarily think that when we say the whole planet. Maybe we do. But Tevel refers to all the people and the animals and the vegetation and the buildings, everything that is included in the planet. So even while Hashem is busy performing miracles, right? Nature continues to the point, Bal Timot, it cannot be shaken. He put specific laws functioning into the world, and that continues. That in and of itself is a tremendous miracle. Nachon kisacham me'az. Hashem, your throne has been around forever, me'az, from old. As we said, he's the kadmon, right? That he's always been here. He precedes everyone and everything. Another way of understanding this pasuk is looking at this word az. This word az here, not really az, but uz, like we have in Az Yashir Moshe. The word az often in Tanakh is connected to that Az Yashir, which is the idea that the Jewish people were able to essentially see the hand of God himself at Kriyas Yamsuf, which was arguably one of the greatest, if not the greatest miracle of the experience of the Jewish people leaving Mitzrayim and being in the desert. And it's from that moment, Hashem, that your throne became nachon, it became firm, it became confirmed. Right? It was at that moment, meaning you could explain it that this is since the day that man was created, it became confirmed or affirmed. We put you on your throne, Hashem, because now we're people and we can make you our king. Or perhaps we can understand it as a reference to Yetzias Mitzrayim, or of course, could just be both. We don't have to choose one or the other. We can have all of them. And interestingly, Rav Hirsch points out, Kis Acha, right? This is us talking to Hashem and saying, it's your throne. We put you there. Right? This is where you belong. We've enthroned you. We have made you our king. It's establishing that relationship, the connection, right? Me'olam ata, you've always existed. You will always exist. You on your throne is an always kind of thing, but now we're here to recognize it. We're so grateful that on a Friday we could remember, this is the day we were created. This is the day we made Hashem our king. Pasuk Gimel. We are now going to move into, as I mentioned just a moment ago, the idea that Hashem can do things supernaturally in a miraculous, feel-good, wonderful kind of a way, right? And unfortunately, there's also times when we recognize that nature is functioning normally so much of the time. We recognize that because, God forbid, there's been a natural disaster. And now David HaMelech is going to refer us to are the laws, I guess, the laws of nature vis-a-vis water. And this is something that, unfortunately, we don't have to look very far into our history. It's not such a threat in Montreal necessarily, but in other places, the impact of water on people and on their possessions is quite significant, right? Certainly, we know in modern times, we have watched unfold online. We've seen hurricanes, we've seen tsunamis, we've seen flooding, massive devastation that could be caused by water. And the next two psukim, which are going to talk about the power of water, are going to be likened to some other forces in the world. But I think before we even get to that, it is important to recognize this tension that exists literally since creation, since the days of Bereshit, where Hashem kind of has to yikavu hamayim. Hashem has to rein in the water. It's almost like if there was if we wanted to say Hashem had any competition, and he doesn't, but if we were to say that there is a force on earth that is competition for God, I think we would say it's the water. Water gives Hashem the hardest time, so to speak, right? I don't want to go down there. I want to be in the top. No, I want to be in the bottom waters. There's that famous midrash about the waters fighting, and Hashem says, no, you go here and you go here. And it almost, we're reading our own, what we hear into the psukim, but you get this sense like, enough already. Yikavu hamayim, let's just separate the waters. And in fact, there's this idea that in order for the way it's expressed in the psukim in Bereshit is that in order for the earth to become the earth, the water has to make room for the earth. It's like the water's tendency, as we know, is to flow. It just wants to take over everything in its path. And it requires Hashem giving it a gvul, giving it a boundary to allow the earth to be there. This is something, we could think about when we say the brachos in the morning, right? That, what's the one with the aretz? I'm blanking. Before Hamichi mitzadei gaver. Okay, I'll have to look it up in a minute. But do I have a sitter here? No, I don't have one in front of me. That it's only because Hashem has created a system where the water stays off the land that we can continue to function on this land, right? So yes, Friday is the day that human beings were created, but we have to recognize that the reason why we continue to function is because the earth continues to stay dry. It continues to be inhabitable for us, and that if water were left to its own devices, it would have swallowed the whole world whole already, right? It would have completely engulfed the earth. And water is a force. It's a force to be reckoned with. We know water can be likened to Torah, and it can have this beautiful, uplifting, life-giving, sustaining image for us. But when we think of rivers, when we think of oceans, waves, breakers, we don't necessarily have that same image of a flowing stream, something that's very delicate and that can nurture all of the animals and all of the people. This is water taken to its extreme. So let's look at how the psukim describe water, and then we'll talk about how some of the Mefarshim understand what the water might be symbolizing. So Nasu Neharot Hashem. Okay, Nasu Neharot, interesting that it calls them oceans, right? We would have maybe thought Nahar is more like a river. So the rivers they're raising, Nasu, they're being raised up. Interesting, Sefaria translated it as sounds. And it's true that water being raised up makes a sound, but the literal translation of tisa or naso means to raise up or lift up. So what you're being given is a real imagery of water like shooting up, coming up, kind of what happens when it hits the shore or when it hits like the breakers, how they just like come up and they have height, they have tremendous height. So Nasu Neharot Hashem, the rivers are raising up towards you, Hashem. Nasu Neharot Kolam, and their voice, their sound, as though the water can express itself, they're so loud. They are so loud. Rav Hirsch points out, this might be on the next pasuk, but Rav Hirsch points out that water gets its loudest right before it's about to fall. And that it makes a tremendous, tremendous sound. Nasu, it's going up. The noise is getting louder. The water is getting stronger. Yis'u neharot tachyam, right? The ocean goes up. Dachyam, you see the word yam in there, dachyam. It actually means like to destroy. I know here it says pounds, but I'd seen in a few places the idea that it means it's going to be taken care of, I guess. It's going to be wiped out. So here we have this imagery, Nasu Neharot, the water's going up. It's going up, and then it's going up, and it's going to be brought down. Says the Sforno and other Mefarshim, the water here represents all of the enemies of Hashem, the enemies of the Jewish people, the enemies of morality, of of delineating right versus wrong. They make so much noise. And they seem to get higher and higher and stronger, and they come with a vengeance to attack, to take over what we have established on our earth, right? What Hashem has established by giving us the Torah. And it gets stronger and it gets stronger. The Seforno actually likens this to the destruction of the first two Batei Mikdash. They were so strong and they wiped out a Beis HaMikdash. And then the second one was so strong and it wiped out the Beis HaMikdash. But for the third time, Yis'u, in the future, describing the future, Neharot Dachyam, the waters are going to wipe themselves out. They're going to bring their own destruction. There's not going to be any strength to them. They're going to peter out, right? They won't have the same might, the same influence. They will, they'll disappear. Mikolos Maim Rabim. Mikolos, either from the waters or greater than the waters, right? Adirim mishpereyam, the breakers of the sea, that pounding sound are greater than the voices of the water that we heard about in Pasuk Gimel, right? So we have this imagery. They're so strong. The waters are so strong and they're so loud. And then David HaMelech tells us, but louder than that, louder than even the loudest of waters are these mishpereyam, are these breakers of the sea. And greater than that, adir b'marom Hashem, right? But what is more powerful than the most powerful natural force? Hashem himself. Hashem the elevated God. He's above the fray, so to speak. And this is the image we have, that no matter what is going on down here, and as I think it was the Sforno pointed out, and maybe some other Mefarshim, it seems like the enemies, those who are fighting against all that is good and moral, right? It seems that they are so powerful and so strong. And we're praying, Hashem, get involved. Hashem, stop them. Hashem, do something. Make it stop. But what David HaMelech is telling us is Hashem doesn't have to get involved. They're going to self-destruct. Yisu neharos dachyam. They're going to come up against the wall, against the seawall, against the shore. Eventually, it's going to peter out. It's their threat is not going to exist any longer. Adir b'marom Hashem. Hashem is higher than that. Hashem doesn't have to, so to speak, get himself dirty. He can, but he doesn't need to. What it requires is patience and faith, right? That if we stick it out long enough, we're going to watch all of these cultures, all of these enemies of Hashem and enemies of morality, right? They're in the long run, they're going to, the defeat comes at their own hands. They're going to fall apart. We've seen that with essentially every major empire that you might study in world history. We spend a lot of time in history studying what happened, why. It's almost always that their fight against what we see as morality, their immorality causes their downfall. That's almost always the case. And if we stick around long enough, God willing, we have the emunah, we have the faith that that's what's going to be. So that Hashem is above all. We have this image of the water getting higher and higher and stronger. But no matter how high it gets and no matter how strong it gets, Hashem is always in charge. Hashem is always on top. It looks like the world is spinning out of control. Often. Right? It takes like 2 minutes of reading the news and it feels like, oh my gosh, what is happening? What is happening in my own community? What is happening in the larger community? What's happening in the world at large? It's like, you don't even know what headline to read first. There's just such a mess everywhere. So it's tempting almost to get caught up in this, the water is coming. It's taking over, that feeling of drowning, that feeling of like, I can't keep my head above water. Collectively, we can't keep our heads above water, which is a very overwhelming feeling, but a very powerful imagery. And yet, rising above that, right, is always the Ribbon Shalom, is always Adir B'Marom Hashem. Hashem is always more powerful. Hashem is always controlling events. His hand has been on the wheel the whole time. I don't know if any of you ever had this experience, but sometimes you're driving and you have, like, maybe you have one hand on the armrest and you're driving with the other hand, the left hand, and the people behind you or next to you can't see that you have your hands on the wheel, right? And my kids have sometimes said to me, Mommy, put your hands on the wheel. Like, no, I got it. I'm okay. I'm driving. My hand is on the wheel. It's just, we're going straight on a highway where you don't need to curve or anything. I don't need two hands. I got one hand. You can't see it, but it's like right there at the bottom left corner of, well, not the corner, but the bottom left part of the wheel. That's where it is. It's fine. You know, Hashem is in total control. It seems like there's nothing running the steering wheel. The steering wheel is just doing whatever it wants, but that's not the case. The hand is always there. Hashem has not lost control. It feels like it, but that is definitely not the case. And water is a very powerful way of giving that imagery to us, because as I said, it only takes it often, unfortunately, takes a tsunami, a hurricane, the flooding. If you can remember some of the recent times where it happens unfortunately all the time in other parts of the world, but in North America, right? Recent, like Hurricane Sandy and threats of tsunami and actual tsunamis that wiped out. I'm sure you all remember watching the footage, you know, in the it was about 15 years ago, I guess, right? The horrific tsunamis that, attacked parts of the world. And it was just like, you can't wrap your head around it. And what that, aside from being mournful and devastated by the loss, right, is also, it's an opening for us to be able to realize, like, how does this not happen all the time? How is it that regularly the water behaves itself? Regularly, people go to the beach and assume that everything will be okay. We know it's a place where dangerous things and devastating things can happen, but that has not stopped most people from going to the beach, right? Because there's an assumption that it's a safe place, that the water does its job. It comes up and it goes back out. It comes up and it goes back out. And we know, unfortunately, right, from horrible stories and tragedies, that that's not always the case. But 99% of the time, that's the case. And so that 1% often helps us realize that 99% of the time, there are some very strong rules of nature at play, some very strong rules of Teva. Okay, finally, Pasuk. Eidosecha ne'emnu ma'od. Your testimonies, Hashem, your decrees are really, they have emunah, ne'emnu, which means they are long lasting, they are enduring, they are dependable. They're always around. And Dr. Esther, I think she's Dr. Esther Shkop, was giving a shir on this parak of Tehillim, and she gave like a transition between Pasuk Dalet and Pasuk Hey that I feel like really changes the way you read the parak. She says, more than the waters, more than the greatness, more than the awe-inspiring, nature of powerful waters, more than that are your edut, are your eduyot, are your testimonies. Hashem, there's no greater proof of you in this world than the mitzvos you gave us. In particular, we talk about what is considered an aid. Sorry. What's considered a sign, a testimony, a siman between us and Hashem. So there are a few things that have that name, and one of them is Shabbos. Shabbos in particular, which this sort of brings us full circle. This parak is the parak of Friday and the parak of Friday night, the parak of Shabbos, because this is the time where we look back at the whole week and we say, oh my gosh, we were so busy. Oh my gosh, we've been running around. We accomplished so many things, but now I'm going to put it all down. I'm going to put everything away, and I'm going to focus on the fact that Hashem rested on this day. This is my testimony. This is my proving. This is my agreeing to the fact that Hashem created the world in 6 days and he rested on the seventh. And by keeping Shabbos, I am aligning myself with that ideal. I am testifying to the fact that he created the world, and I've bought into the whole system, right? There is very often nothing more challenging than keeping a full halachic Shabbos, right? When it comes to finances, when it comes to all sorts of other challenges that people might have, keeping a proper Shabbos, not engaging in business, not thinking about finances, right? Not doing things because it's a time when I could get things done. That is the testimony. That's the proof that we recognize Hashem, this transition day on Friday. That's how I make Hashem my king, right? Hashem can only become king when there are people who can acknowledge him as their king. Otherwise, he might be on the throne, but if nobody could see him on the throne, if nobody puts the crown on his head, so to speak, he's not really a king. So it requires the people in order to make him king. And that happens. How are we mamlich Hashem on Friday and Friday night? By keeping Shabbos. That is greater than any force of nature, is that like one-on-one quiet relationship that we acknowledge and establish in our lives when we keep Shabbos. Leveischa na'ava kodesh, right? It is a perfect name, na'ava. It's so fitting to call your house Kodesh, that relationship that we have with you, that home that we build with you, by keeping Shabbos, by keeping your testimonies and all of your mitzvos. That's holiness, right? We know that the concept of Kedusha refers to when somebody separates themselves, prushim, right? Kedoshim tiyu, really Rashi says, is prushim tiyu, is to separate yourself. It's to pull back, right? You're fully engaged during the week, and Shabbos Kodesh means pulling myself out of that just for the next 25 hours. And so that is the perfect name for this home, right? This bayit, this relationship that we build with Hashem. That is the epitome of Kadosh. That's the epitome of Kedusha. Hashem la'orach yamim. Right? And he will be Hashem. This will exist forever. And this is true, frankly, right? Whether we've bought in or not, right? We said this, that Hashem was the Kadmon. He was always here, and he will be here le'orech yamim, forever, right? Even those people who are blessed to live on this earth for 100+ years, right, don't have that same length of days that we have when we refer to Hashem being here for orech yamim. There was one other thing I wanted to mention, and now, one other idea about Shabbos. I heard this, I mentioned this, I think, to Shira recently, but I am taking this course right now with Sharsheret. Sharsheret is an organization, an incredible organization based out of New York or New Jersey, that is helping women for years and years already, support and medical advice, you name it, literally everything for women, Jewish women from the Jewish community who are facing or dealing with breast cancer and ovarian cancer. It affects our community in a almost disproportionate type of way. There's a lot of education and a lot of support that's needed, but we also experience it differently than people in other communities. Every community has its distinct experience. So doing this course as a way to sort of brush up on my education and information in ways that we can try to be helpful to the women in our lives and our communities. And one of the speakers last week said something that we all know, but she said it with such assuredness, with such confidence that I feel like, and it fits. So it's the difference between during the week and Shabbos. She explained the following thing. When a person is fighting a physical challenge, When a person has received a diagnosis and requires treatment, and the body has to be completely and totally focused on healing itself, when God forbid there has been a trauma or an accident, and the only way for the person to survive is for the body to completely focus on healing itself, the body does an amazing thing. And this was a doctor who said it, so I can't describe the science behind it, but it was a doctor, so we're going to believe her. She says that the body purposefully and with total intention shuts down the brain, shuts down all ability to think or to feel, because that requires a lot of energy. We know that, right? Worrying requires a lot of energy. Feeling requires energy. Thinking requires energy. When the body is in crisis, the body has to put all of its energy into getting through the crisis and healing itself. And so what often happens, some of you may have experienced this, hopefully we're able to look back on these things and grow from them and learn from them. But I think we've all had this to one degree or another, that when the body is fighting something and is trying to care for itself and heal, there is not a lot of thinking going on. There's not a lot of feeling going on. It's just put one foot in front of the other. My job right now is to get well. And I can't focus or think about anything else. I'm not gonna, try to understand it, and I'm not gonna try to feel it. I'm just gonna get through. And what the speaker explained was, as soon as the body has reached a point of, I guess we would say like homeostasis, has reached a point where now things are back to ground level, right? To our default state of health. As soon as that happens, and she said it literally could be within moments, where the person is now no longer in crisis, the body has healed itself, then all of a sudden, because now the amount of energy that's required has shifted, then that opens the gates for all of the thoughts and feelings to come in. And that's why we so often have people it's so difficult when someone is facing a crisis. We're there for them. We're checking in on them, and we're cooking for them, and we're buying them presents, and we're davening for them and all of that. And then as soon as we hear that thank God, they're stable, they're no longer critical, they have a good prognosis now, we're like, oh, okay, amazing. And we just move on with our life because, we're all busy. It makes sense. But it's often when they hit that point that people then need the most support, because now they're starting to feel what it is that they've just been through. Now they're starting to process what it is that they've just been through. And there's often a lot of feeling and a lot of thinking that has to happen. And it can be very challenging. There's a reason why the body couldn't allow that to happen while the person was in recovery, right? There's a reason. It could not have done both. So it had to focus on just the physical. But as soon as the physical has gotten to a baseline, then the emotional, the cognitive, all of that comes into play. That idea struck me very significantly, just because I think it is very much our experience. And it's just something to be aware of for sure. It gave like a real explanation for why for so many of us, we've experienced that. But it also, for me, helped me understand Shabbos. Because during the week, right, we are so go, 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 go. I've got to get this done. I've got to focus all my energy on doing the things that I have to do and accomplishing and checking the things off my list. And a lot of the things I'm doing are important and good and necessary and all of that. But it's only once my body has, so to speak, shut itself off in a different way that Shabbos comes in. Right? Then all of a sudden you're like, oh, wow. Now I have time to think. Now I have time to feel. Now I have time to look back over everything that went on this whole week and process and be grateful and maybe be sad and maybe be happy and maybe a little bit of both, right? And just, whoa. But you can't have all of that happening at the same time. We're human beings. We really don't multitask very well. So it was an interesting parallel idea that I think certainly is true in the world of our experience when it comes to our physical health. But also I think when it comes to our spiritual health, it's equally true. And it's a good reminder. We say this parak Friday morning, and we say it again Friday afternoon, which is interesting. One of the things we talked about the very beginning when we started studying the Shir Shel Yom was the idea that this parallels one of the korbanos that was brought on a daily basis, the korban tamid. And there's a big discussion in the Gemara. Well, if they brought the korban tamid, the daily sacrifice, every morning and every bein ha'arbayim, like late afternoon, why do we only say Shir Shel Yom at Shachris? And there's a whole discussion. And we conclude that we only need to say it once. But Friday, It's interesting. Friday, we actually say the Shir Shel Yom twice. It's like there's something very powerful about a Friday with all the things we have to get done, but about recognizing the points of this parak. It needs to be said a second time. As we go into Shabbos, we need this reminder that yes, the world sometimes feels like it's spinning out of control, and it feels like the waters are raging and the world is so loud and there's so much craziness going on. But at the end of the day, Adir Bamaram Hashem, Hashem is above it all, right? He has not just risen above, he's always been above it all. He's been controlling it from above, even though it doesn't always feel that way, but his hand is always on the steering wheel. And this idea that we get to experience Hashem through nature and all of those things. That's a way that he reveals himself to us. We spoke about the idea of the Malbim and the miraculous nature of nature, as well as the miraculous nature of the supernatural, right? But they're both reflected in this parak, as well as this idea that the perfect time to reflect upon this is to establish ourselves as having the edus, the testimony, and in particular, the testimony, it could be of Matan Torah, but for us, we'll focus on the idea that this is what Shabbos is for us as we go Friday night into accepting Shabbos during Kabbalah Shabbos, and we repeat this parak. It's a beautiful, beautiful time to let the body get its break and begin to focus on some of the other things that we haven't been able to focus on during the week. And that testimony, as we said, right, that's really more than, as Dr. Shkup said, more than all of the proofs we have from nature and the supernatural. More than all of that are the eduyot of Hashem, right? Is the keeping of the Torah, and in particular is the keeping of Shabbos that takes us and reminds us of really what's important and what's significant. Okay. Gosh, 5 psukim took us so long. I apologize that we went all the way till 11 o'clock, but that is Perek Tzadi Gimel. We will meet, God willing. I know there's a break next week, but I feel like we missed so many weeks. We will study the Shir Shel Yom for Shabbos next week. And that will complete our seven parak series on the Shir Shel Yom. So I look forward to studying with all of you next week. And I wish you all a great week this week. Thanks for being here. Thanks for learning.
Happy Purim Katan.
Thank you. Yes, that's right.